A quick reminder to grad students, please swipe your card in the back to get credit for being here. One of the things, if you look at the schedule from now to the end of the semester, we have a seminar every week. So if I forget to send a reminder, you've just been reminded. So today we're lucky to have a tag team presentation from 4 folks from the library. I'm going to introduce Sara Mannheimer, who's sort of the lead presenter, and I'm going to let her introduce the rest. And Sara is assistant professor in the MSU libraries. And I've worked with her and Scott Young on a project doing the sentiment analysis that hopefully we'll be able to carry forward a little bit more. But with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sara.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you guys all coming. The presenters today are me, Sara Mannheimer. I'm the data management librarian. Scott Young is the digital image-based librarian. Jason Clark, the head of library informatics and computing, and Justin Cranach is the researcher at the library. And so we're going to be talking through 3 library research projects we've been doing, over the course of which we encountered some ethical questions that made us look a little further into some of the data-driven research that we do, and hopefully these questions can have broader implications for the research that you guys are doing. So the 3 projects are Twitter sentiment analysis, some personalized web search that Jason is doing, and semantic identity that Justin research. And the questions that arose centered around these 3 major themes. First, can versus should. So just because we can pull down thousands of tweets from the Twitter API, does that mean we necessarily should use that information to conduct research? Personalized services, balancing with user privacy. And then in the end, really, who benefits? Is it the researcher? Is it the user? Is it the broader scholarly community? So the first research we'll talk about is mine and Scott's research on Twitter sentiment analysis. Being the data management librarian, part of my job is advocacy for open data. And so we were attempting to find the conversation around open data that was happening on Twitter, and then use sentiment analysis to assess whether researchers in certain disciplines were feeling positively about sharing their data or negatively. So we pulled down tweets from researchers in 16 disciplines from the Twitter API, and then we isolated tweets that discussed data, and then we coded the sentiment using Mechanical Turk, which is a digital labor, online digital labor marketplace, they call it, from Amazon, where people can do small tasks for small amounts of money, hopefully creating a big result. So sentiment analysis, actually, right? So some of the tweets that we pulled down was very obvious whether the sentiment was positive or negative. Data, 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 I love you! So very positive tweets. But Zainab Tufek is a sociologist, and she's talking here about a sentiment analysis that Newsweek did on the Gamergate hashtag on Twitter, which Gamergate was a conversation about surrounding sexism in the video game industry. And the Newsweek research said that 90% of these tweets were neutral, when in actuality it meant they just couldn't discern whether they were positive or negative. And as Zainab says, sentiment analysis is hard with only 140 characters. It's really hard to tell what people are actually trying to say. And then also, the Gamergate conversation was obviously non-neutral. This was a supercharged conversation. There were people speaking for it, against it, in all kinds of ways. So it wasn't a 90% neutral conversation. So Newsweek used this sentiment analysis to try to gain insight into the Gamergate conversation. And in the same way, lots of people are using this big data to try to gain insights into all sorts of things. So for example, NIH has a project now, Big Data to Knowledge. And on this website, they say, the ability to harvest the wealth of information contained in biomedical big data will advance our understanding of human health. So, but as sociologist Nathan Jurgensen says, numbers are seductive because they look like answers. And in the case of big data, lots of numbers can look like a lot of answers, but it's not always the case. So For us, with our Twitter sentiment analysis project, our main ethical concerns had to do with perceived public, informed consent, and then the digital labor that was happening using the technical term. And Scott, that's these credits.
Hello, so I'm Scott Young. I'm a digital initiatives librarian at the library. And so I work on the web and social media. So this particular research project is of interest to me through social media and through the web. So as Sarah says, these are three ethical questions that came to mind when we were working on this project. So we'll start by going back in time a little bit. This is me on Twitter expressing an opinion from 2.5 years ago. I was having a conversation with another researcher, and I said at the time, in September of 2013, that I've taken Twitter and Instagram content as public and therefore reusable. So reusable by me and others in my position to do research. And at the time, this is what I thought. But as we have gotten more into this research, it's become apparent that there's a level of nuance and depth that is really surprising and challenging. And it starts with just the idea of public and what constitutes a public. And there's not one simple big public that everyone has access to. There's different perceived publics, and different users on social media can perceive the boundary of their public, of their community, within a certain boundary. And if researchers from outside of that boundary use their data or use their community for their own research purposes, that can come as a surprise to them, and a surprise to the extent of being an ethical breach. So keeping this idea of different types of public in mind was really important for us. In the library, we have an ethicist named Michael Zimmer who's published a lot on this. This was a seminal paper that he titled, "But the Data is Already Public." This is from 2010. It was a common refrain then, and a still, unfortunately, common refrain now. Just the idea that if someone publishes content online, be it through social media or the web, that anyone could use it and read it. But as social media is becoming more popular, and the data from social media is becoming research data, there have been calls for higher standards for this kind of research. So this is a column from Science Mag from a couple years ago that does just that. It says that we need to have higher standards for this kind of research. And it hinges a lot on informed consent, which is the next ethical question for us. So let's take a walk through what happens when informed consent isn't acquired. So in 2012, Uber, everyone's favorite taxi cab company, published a blog post that they cheaply titled "Ride to Glory." You may or may not remember this, but essentially what they did is they looked at their rider and location data and they determined which of their users have the most one-night stands, and they published this data. They thought this was a fun, cool thing to do, and this was reported across the web, sometimes with property imagery. And then when they were called on it, essentially, they deleted their blog post, and now it's 404s, and there's no explanation or follow-up from this. And so this led to questions such as, can we even trust Uber? There's a lot of reasons not to trust Uber. This is one of them. Zainab Tufekci, writing the New York Times, answered that question by saying, no, we can't trust Uber. The users of Uber, they didn't know that the company was going to use their data in this way. So this is a really clear example of an ethical breach with a lack of informed consent. But Uber doesn't have IRBs and ethical standards that they hold themselves to. But in academia, we do. Yet this still happens in academia. You may remember this from 2014. This was the major study collaboration between Facebook and Cornell, where Facebook manipulated the news feeds of about 1% of their users, which at the time amounted to about 700,000 users. And they increased or decreased the amount of positive or negative words that users saw on their timeline. And from that, they were able to essentially pull the levers on which posts their users liked or commented or shared. And so they could control the emotion of their users. And this quickly led to calls for ethical breaches because they didn't inform their users that they were doing this thing. They manipulated the newsfeeds of users without their knowledge. Now, the authors of that study, they did issue a follow-up, and they said that their work was consistent with Facebook's data use policy, to which all users agreed prior to creating an account on Facebook, constituting informed consent for this research. So this is definitely on the line of informed consent. It may be legally true and technically true that when you sign through, when you create a Facebook account, you hand over your data and your activities to this kind of research. But in actuality, users don't really understand that. So that's where the sort of ethical consideration comes into play. These researchers may be legally on firm ground, but ethically they're on very shaky ground. As legal scholar James Perlman says, the study is a scandal because it brought Facebook's troubling practices into our realm, academia, where we still have standards of treating people with dignity and serving the common good. And so this led to our third ethical issue with sentiment analysis, which is mechanical Turk. So I'm curious, in the room here, who has heard mechanical Turk before? Okay, that's great. That's a lot of people. How many people have used mechanical Turk before? Okay, fewer people. So Mechanical Turk, it's an online marketplace. My dean Kenny is in the room today, so I'm going to sort of put a spotlight on him. Last week he called Mechanical Turk an online sweatshop. So in some ways that's true, and there's been researchers that have gone on the other side and tried to see what Mechanical Turk is like for the workers. I'll just read what this researcher experienced. I was surprised by the degree and variety of what I, as a Mechanical Turk worker, perceived to be unethical research. In answering surveys, I was made to work much longer than promised, refused payment for work I had already done without sufficient explanation for recourse, and I was not provided with an appropriate method to protest or to receive redress. So for us, as researchers, we looked at Mechanical Turk as an amazing resource. It was affordable, we could access it, and it could scale up our sentiment analysis work very quickly and easily. However, there is an entire world of Turkers, in this case, who are possibly being exploited by this platform. Amazon benefits, we benefit by creating research results, but the workers are paid very little under poor working conditions. And the problem with this, as communication theorist says, in most crowdsourcing platforms, such as Mechanical Turk, the fragmentation of tasks disenfranchises cognitive workers by disconnecting them from the final intellectual work. So the Mechanical Turkers are completely anonymous to us. Even if we acknowledge Mechanical Turk in the paper, it's impossible for us to acknowledge people who actually did the work for us. So this is fundamentally an imbalance in the labor market that benefits us and benefits Amazon. And so how we can even engage ethically with Mechanical Turk is questionable. To try to help that, though, there have been resources such as guidelines for academic requesters that help people in our position engage with Mechanical Turk ethically, to try to treat the online laborers with the amount of respect that they do that they deserve. However, the very nature of the platform may not even allow that. So I'm going to finish with an illustration from about 150 years ago of Mechanical Turk. So the Mechanical Turk is this device where a magician will pretend to be performing some magic feats, but really being conducted by the box, but inside the box is an actual human. So in this case, the Turkers are the man in the box, and we're kind of the magician. So we have the benefit of the audience, we get the praise, but really who's doing the work is the person involved. So when we think of who benefits in this arrangement, we benefit, but the Turker maybe less so. And I'm going to pass off to Jason to talk about his work with personalized search.
Hey, can everybody hear me okay? Speaking like this? Okay. So I'm going to talk, one of the challenges of this presentation was we had all different sets of research streams, but as we started to look into the research, we found a number of threads related to privacy and ethics, and that's what kind of brings these disparate projects together. So the second project that we talked about is actually a search project. And we talk about the sort of pieces of the Search Act as a speech act itself, and how identity and context are all kind of conflated out of that. I'm actually going to show, I have a prototype that's on GitHub and a demo of what you can do with some of this information if you start to use it. And then we'll leave time for more questions about why should you be using this kind of information. So libraries. Libraries, we think a lot about search. Public libraries, academic libraries. We think a lot about how to construct search, how to divide search, how to build facets for search. This is our cat search. It's something we used to find computer science articles, or if you use Google Scholar, you take the same idea, this idea of search engine retrieval. And so it's a particularly rich research environment for us. And we even define ourselves as kind of corollary or even binary to things like Google. So you can read that inside the search box. It says, obviously it's a librarian and Google color, but inside it says the original search engine. So our field has been focused on this for a while. I'm going to step back a little bit and talk a bit about another binary. Does anybody know who this is? It's Descartes. And what he came up with was one of the first kind of dualisms or binaries of how the mind works, and how the mind is, and how the body is. And there were these two sort of separate entities that work together, but we're not actually part of each other. So this concept of mind and body and this sort of this idea of man in a box, all of this sort of plays together into a broader conception of another expression that Gilbert Ryle came up with, and he was refuting Descartes, where he talked about the ghost in the machine. So the ghost of the mind kind of controlling the body, right? And this binary kind of holds up when you start to think about how there are these different pieces of a search query. There's kind of the literal, physical search query itself, the pattern that we think of, like the literal aspect of the search query. And then there's an inferred aspect. There's a contextual component of any search query. And if you think of it, if I break that down a little further, think about an initial query, which is at the top here. And then you think about the literal pattern match of a string, which is a very common way that we bring relevance or match and push results into people's views. But then there's also this other sense of things that happen around the query. Time of day, where it was taken, location in time and space. And so when you start to think about the Search Act, one of the things I realized with this research is we could start to bring in context and intention modeling. And so the question I started to ask is, what are the ghosts inside of the Search Act? Because I believe there's a residual component to every Search Act, just like when I speak to you and when I say it. So, connecting it to our theory today, I want you to keep in mind, as I'm showing you the things we pulled out of a search query, think about how we do this while keeping privacy in place, while allowing for added value. Because I believe the prototype for these kinds of expectations of a search interface are very valuable. How we get there is another matter. So you can do things like cues from the live query itself. You can watch for natural language. So this would be a sort of stop word list that I can watch. Depending on what I'm seeing here, and this, if you look at like the iPhone, Siri has a list of keywords that she or that machine program watches for, and they use that to build context and different kinds of knowledge about what people are asking. And so you can push it through. There's a PHP example and a Python example of how you move it through based on those keywords and maybe present a different kind of facet. So that's just a little query. The machine itself, when we make a request of, we hit that submit button, page is requested, all along the back of a web page are HTTP requests that has all kinds of information in it. This is a snapshot of the very first part of an HTTP header. You can see things like user agent, a page URL, referring URL, IP address, depending on if you're on a Tor network or not, a timestamp giving you time and day. You can see things like what's inside the cookie. So these global server and HTTP headers also provide context that we can build a refined search from and add to our understanding of what the query, what somebody's asking. Obviously, you can also get things from the browser itself or the network. So you saw that in the header, but you can also place something in time and space. And this is a kind of a return of what you might get from an API call that provides not only IP address, but obviously postal code, country code, and then even beyond that, even when a Tor network, which is an anonymizing network that lets these that HTTP requests bounce around, so you can't really track where people are, you can get, just from loading the browser itself, this is a project called Am I Unique? And they talk about a browser fingerprint. Well, from that, you can actually get, just from the JavaScript function of loading a page, regardless of what else. Sorry, regardless. Regardless isn't a word. From the actual function of JavaScript, you can see things like what plugins are available, what platform are they on, iOS, Android, do they have cookies enabled, do they have do not track, you can get a date, you can get a timestamp, you can get a screen height, you can get a screen depth, so you can get a sense of what kind of device are they on, a high resolution device, which will indicate something other than like a large desktop or a TV screen or a handheld. So, as I'm grabbing and looking into this research, I'm realizing there is so much, there are so many different data points that we can use, but the question of how do we use them is really what's starting to resonate in my head. Another thing you can think of is the actual query logs that we have. So these are just raw queries of what the string was. And you can use that to actually surface various suggested searches when a search starts to fail. So bring that forward. And I like this tweet from Benedict Evans who talks about, if you think about where we started with the web, Yahoo was a list of directories. We quickly realized that didn't scale, and at some point it was going to break down. That's where the rise of Google happens, and we have PageRank and the search engine itself realizing that search is what allow this internet index to scale. But at some point in time, we turn back around to there's just even too much inside the search engine itself. And that's when these enhancements, this added value, comes forward as a possibility. And I think we're in a moment of curating search. We're back in a moment of thinking about how do we improve the sort of 10 blue links and the multitude of results that are there for people. So we apply these cues, and then we show different parts of the search index and introduce additional context. So this is anticipatory design. This is a new design model where you actually model the system, you do guesswork, not guesswork, solid research work about what you expect somebody to use, how you expect somebody to use your system. And then you do intention mining, which is a form of data mining to understand the intention of the query, those pieces that I was telling you about. So the search prototype itself lives here. The code is available there. It's kind of noodly prototype code, but if you wanted to look at it, you're free to do that. The prototype itself is very deliberate in the design. The facets and all the enhancements happen on the right side, and then the 10 blue links are the sort of common pattern matches you would see in a common search engine kind of search. But what you get is you move through, for something that's under 30 results, you'll see maybe 4 or sometimes 2 facets that appear on the right. And the idea there is that if a search result is small enough, then it doesn't need that much help as far as refining it. But as you get further in, so a larger result set, you'll see more of the facets start to open up. As you get into, as you're watching for the actual cues of a natural language question, so this was lit up as a voice search, or if it actually somebody is using a who, what, when, where, why, or some of those other keywords, you'll get an inquiry about do you want to talk to a person. When we had those, this is sort of that cue from when the search is starting to fail, you can introduce that analysis of search logs into, right, so that you say, okay, these are some common queries that people use that do result in various successful searches. And then sort of a hokey way to think about local context. You can actually watch for time of day and or weather and offer, in this case, we're inviting people into the library to come and use, come out and have a call based on the weather. But there's also, I say that kind of jokingly, but you can do really interesting things. Like, I also have a facet in there where I'm watching for time in the semester, And given if it's early in the semester, I make a joke about you still have time to read, come and check our browse collection. If it's later in the semester, if it's paper writing season, you should come and see our research library. This is just one example of using time and space to turn search into a conversation. Of course, with all of this, you can see how all that information I was pulling from headers, from various, the query itself, context. What we want to avoid is something like this. The idea that you don't want stalking, but you can see that I'm torn because there is some real added value to the work of building this context and understanding the intention. But there's this moment where you have to understand where the act value stops being value and starts feeling like a form of surveillance. So to return to our old Frenchman, he spoke cogito ergo sum, which was I think therefore I am, one of his first. The idea of the concept of the mind. But what I'm suggesting is that when we search is an act of identity. It's a way that we express ourselves. There's all kinds of knowledge that's part of that search act. So there are ghosts in this machine. What we do as a profession, what do we choose to do with them? How do we explain the use of those ghosts? Not to really move away from this idea, but also to think through how to better improve and turn search into that conversation. The next step for this particular research we'll be focusing on that systems design I talked about. We're actually doing the research with a number of our research librarians to help come up with a better system, a very preliminary, rudimentary system that I have in place. And then also looking at that question that we have here that Justin's going to speak to also, and that Scott and Sara have already alluded to. Where does the value start? And where does the sense of I don't like that this machine knows this much about those questions coming forward. Justin,
so as Jason said, I'm Justin. I think Sara said that too. But I am a semantic web researcher for the library. And I'm going to be talking about two relatively new projects and the sort of reflexive title, Semantics of Ethics, or Ethics and Semantics, just to sort of give you an opportunity to wrap your head around something that really can't be wrapped around. So to start, we're going to go back to the late 90s and we call the classic matrix, right? And as this graphic shows us, the world is full of data, right? And that data is just ones and zeros, but it's also not just ones and zeros, as Jason and Scott and Sara have implied that that data has things associated, right? It has contextual context, it has socio-cultural value, it has personal privacy embedded in it, so on and so forth. And in a world rich with data, in 2001, this rather dapper gentleman, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, came up with a concept that wanted to shift from a web that was, yes, data rich, but really just static data, right? It's a bunch of documents posted up on the internet. They didn't really talk to one another. You couldn't really do much with them. So Tim here writes an article in the Scientific American. And basically what he says is we need to shift from a web of documents to a web of data. And he coins this term software agents, which also fits nicely with matrix. And the idea is that these software agents can construct meaning of this data, right? They can understand the context, they can understand what this data means to an individual user, what the data means in relationship to other data. Basically, they can comb through all this data and get to do really interesting, interrelated things. And this is very new in 2001, right? It's actually still quite new now. We're still trying to figure out what this data interlinking can do for us. And also a lot of the implications that are along with it. And Tim had really big and bold ambitions for the semantic web. He said, properly designed, the semantic web can assist the evolution of human knowledge as a whole. That's great, right? No one can argue with something that's going to advance evolution, right? Make us better as a culture, better as a society, better as humanity, right? So those are the noble foundations for what we now call the semantic web. And the semantic web is built on a foundation of linked data, right? And this is the linked data cloud as of August of 2014, right? So you can see a bunch of nodes, a bunch of hubs. Things are interconnected, talking to different data repositories in interesting ways. And what we're doing in the library is we're trying to find ways to optimize web content regarding academic institutions and academic researchers that fits into this model to increase interoperability of that data, as well as discoverability of individuals, individual data, the visibility of individual scholar products, and then ultimately the authority. So you know that this John Smith is not this John Smith, but this John Smith, right? So that's sort of the background of what we're working with. And there are various ways to get this data to talk, right? This is just a simple sketch of what the JSON of the data document looks like. And basically, it's just a syntax where you get things to point to other things. Say this is this, which is related to so and so, and we know that this is what it says it is because of this data source, so on and so forth. Right? So again, it's interlinking those data, and it's just code that you would embed into a page, and it works very smoothly. Right? You don't have to make drastic changes to find the authority of the entity or the document. And really what it comes down to is this, again, the software agent, right? So you're teaching the machine to teach itself, right? So you can determine these relationships so it can then understand what everything means in context, both in a localized, specific context, as well as in that sort of global gobbledygook of all that different data. And this can come in to play in search, right? Some of the examples that Jason brought in, right? The search engine can determine what you may or may not be looking for, how things are interconnected, give you some suggestions of other things you may be interested in, right? Things of that nature. So, one of the projects that we're working on is visibility of academic institutions. And semantic web research has been going on essentially since 2001 when Tim Berners-Lee suggested the idea. However, it hasn't really shifted into the academic sphere. So what we're concerned with is when you search for Montana State Library, you want to find information about Montana State University Library. This is a screenshot from before semantic web optimization. So as you can see, it's sort of a muddled mix of things, right? And you actually don't end up with a direct link to the library homepage, which is problematic if you're looking for information about the Montana State University Library. So after some semantic web optimization, things changed rather dramatically. This is from this afternoon. What you can see, first and foremost, the first gen is a very lovely sitemaps link directly to the library's homepage, as well as some subdomain content. So you know where the web home, right, the web location of the library is. You also now know where the physical location of the library is, which is embedded through the Google Maps location. And that knowledge card over there on the right. And I guess I should say there's also a knowledge card now, right? So you get that good snapshot of information, which contains a lot of helpful info, including pertinent business information, hours of operation, address, phone number, when it's founded, and all that kind of fun stuff. You also know the type of business, right? So obviously, library is in the title, but it's good to confirm that, right? The business type. Get the Wikipedia style entry. You also get some verified social media information. And then over, if we switch back to the left-hand side, we can see some additional social media content, both with our Facebook and Twitter as well. Yeah. And then, again, Wikipedia. And then the two things that come down at the bottom are, and you can't really read that, I can't even really read from up here, but it's other things that you may be looking for while conducting a search for Montana State University Library, right? So we've got the university itself. Looks like we've got the bookstore, the Bozeman Public Library, for Freedom Fieldhouse, and then we've got some other things in terms of hours of operation, staff, so on and so forth, right? So all those things which are contextually linked with the library. And what we've done is we've seeded different linked data, structured data sources, right? So that data can link, and then it presents itself in this nice, very helpful search results page. So increasing the visibility and authority of the academic institution. Great. And again, it works on these notions of interoperability, right? So that data can function in different platforms, different services. Discoverability, so that data can talk to itself or talk to other sources of data. And then visibility and authority of the entity itself. And that begs the question, right? So more visibility, more discoverability is a good thing. Problem. Certainly in the case of Montana State University Library, right? The more people that we can get to find the library, the more people we go to the library, use the services, right? You get an enriched academic experience as a student or as a researcher. Wonderful. Where this leads us, though, is to this, what I'm calling the reflexive building, right? So Tim Berners-Lee, 2001, comes up with the semantic web, the software agents, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. In the intervening 15 years, we have been really excited about the semantic web technology and idea, the architecture for the web, because it presents a lot of opportunity. But now that we're a decade and some change into the concept, it gives us an opportunity to sort of step back and ask some questions about why are we doing this, where are we heading, who's involved, so on and so forth. Are there any unintended consequences? And a framework for approaching that is this what's called socio-technical considerations. Basically what that considers is not just the technology in and of itself, which, great, if we can teach machines to be smarter and connect to different data sources, that's all great, but we have to think, how does that technology operate in its social context, right? Are there any unintended consequences? Are there any individuals or vulnerable populations being unintentionally harmed by linking all this data, making people or people or organizations more visible on the web? So just something to sort of keep in the back of the brain as we move forward. And there's been a growing body of research that addresses some of these things, both in legal areas in terms of rules and regulations for the semantic web. How do we legislate what's happening with this interoperability of data? Computer ethics are thinking. Computer ethics professors are thinking about the professional implications. Practitioners are thinking about how does this change our practice in terms of design and development and programming and so on and so forth. So people are beginning to ask these questions, but we're really in the very early stages of that reflexive term. And these 4 points are very reductive, but they summarize nicely the body of literature that addresses these things. And it comes down to informed consent, which Scott mentioned earlier, but not in the sense that we need to have people fill out IRB forms before they use the internet, but just this idea of we should have a sense of how the data is being used about us as individuals, right? Or at least, glance in terms of service every now and again. Data persistence is a big deal, particularly when data is moving across different channels and it's being connected and linked in very interesting ways. Privacy, right? That's the long-standing internet concern. And then this, programmers and users or users versus users, right? We don't want to set up a dichotomy of programmers who try to do really interesting things in this new semantic environment, but we don't want those things to be at the expense of the users, right? And again, that connects with data persistence and privacy issues and informed knowledge of what's happening. So we talked earlier about the organizational visibility, right, with the library. The other project we're beginning with is addressing issues of disambiguation of scholars, right, of researchers, people who produce scholarly products. And one of the areas we're investigating are a number of different services which aim to provide persistent digital identifiers for individuals, again, so you know that this John Smith is not this John Smith. And so you can also associate the scholarship, the research, the data sets, whatever the case might be, with those individuals. And ORCID is one example of a service that's set up to do that very thing. And there are a variety of other different services which market themselves toward humanities scholars or bench scientists or computer scientists, whatever the case might be. But what they do as a whole is, again, they try to disambiguate and associate, provide some authority and some visibility to those individuals, which is great. Again, if you can get your scholarship in the hands and minds of more people, it's going to enrich the academic experience, motivate the conversation, so on and so forth. But I want to draw attention to sort of the unintended consequences of actions of some of these organizations. So academia.edu is one such organization that focuses on the openness of scholarship. It's designed to provide a platform to make scholarship more visible, make it more readily accessible to more and more people, sort of subverting or getting the paywall to be less of an obstacle to creating scholarly products. And as you can see, they have 32 million plus users. They have over 8 million papers uploaded to the service. It's sort of pitched as a Facebook for academics, right? A social networking service for academics. You follow other researchers, you can like or recommend their data, their papers, so on and so forth. So it's been quite popular. But just a couple weeks ago, it had sort of some notoriety that it would probably otherwise like to avoid in the development of the hashtag deleteacademia.edu. And this was a result of well, here's some of the hashtag activity, but the hashtag was born out of a email that a product developer from academia.edu sent to a select handful of academia.edu users, wondering if they would be interested in paying to have their papers reviewed for possible recommendation within the service. And that might sound kind of muddled, but the way academia.edu works is select users are provided editor roles, and as editors, they can recommend papers to the community, right? To increase the visibility of the paper, gets the paper into more and more people's hands, or at least provide the opportunity to get it in more and more people's hands. And this conversation was very heated. Again, it's 3.5 weeks old, but London School of Economics jumped on it, Duke University Library jumped on it, the Department of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education. I mean, it's been quite the kerfuffle, if you will, in academic land. But this is basically how it started, right? This guy, Scott Johnson, is a classics professor in Oklahoma, received an email from Adnan, who is a product developer at academia.edu. And basically, it comes down to this little part of the email right here, which basically says, would you be open to paying a small fee to submit any upcoming papers to our board of editors to be considered for recommendation, right? So essentially, would you like to pay us for the possibility of us recommending your papers? And Scott Johnson basically says, hey, academia, is this for real? Have you been hacked? I'm hoping it's the latter, right? So this really comes down to this notion of what Scott thought academia.edu was providing for in terms of a service and a network, and what Adnan, as the product developer, who's trying to determine, what are the different ways that we can really leverage the service and subvert those paywalls, right? We can make more scholarship available to more and more people. And poor Adnan, he says, well, I didn't make any Twitter friends today. We'll try again tomorrow. So he's sort of taking it lightly, but he also wrote a very nice Medium blog post. And Adnan's boss came to his defense, right? Richard Price, who's the founder and current president of academia.edu, basically wrote a long letter, blog post, and he says, this is a crazy idea. And he sort of, again, is very playful and tries to sort of push it off as, this is just something we're toying around with, but it comes down to this idea, when you submit a journal article to be published as open access, you pay article processing charge, right? And what it does is it offsets some of the costs of publishing that article, right? Going through the whole publication process. So what Richard Price and Adnan are saying is we're basically trying to take that model and apply it to the recommendation system for academia.edu. And what academia.edu users, right, the scholars who are on this network, are basically saying, whoa, you're not really doing that. You're asking us to make the decision between scholarly integrity, right, which is the people will recommend it if they like it, versus the, hey, I'll pay you to like it and recommend it. So it in many ways seems like a no-brainer, right? Like, no, I shouldn't have to pay for recommendations, but in the interest of the academia.edu business model, this makes sense for them, right? They're not paying, or they're not asking users to pay for recommendations. They're asking users to pay for the recommendation process, which was not really spelled out very well and has caused some concern. And it raises a lot of questions, right? 3 of which we see on the screen, right? Are they an ethical company? Was Adnan acting in an ethical fashion? But largely the bottom one, right? Like, how do we know how to answer those questions, let alone the multitude of other questions that arise from this and situations similar to this? And I don't have any answers for this, but we'll get back to that in a second. So we're going to go from France and Descartes to Germany, and this as a gentleman, Immanuel Kant. He was a German philosopher in the 19th century, or 18th century, sorry. And he had a number of great ideas. He was about morality and reason and so on and so forth. The top one, categorical imperative, gives us sort of a window through which we can look at these kinds of issues, right? And the gist of the categorical imperative is basically action is immoral if it uses another person merely as means to an end, right? So if you're basically just using someone to get to something else that you want without consideration of that individual, it's immoral, right? Pretty straightforward. So just use someone to get something else. And then this notion of the a posteriori proposition, right? And that comes down to how we reason think that, how we make decisions, right? And a posteriori propositions rely upon experience, right? So complex matters. What's happening, where it's happening, when it's happening, who's involved in that happening, right? All that stuff matters. And basically what it comes down to is propositions, right? Decisions are logically contingent, right? So there's no overarching rationality or moral code that we can apply. We have to understand context, right? So in the sentiment analysis, in the intention mining and search, we need to understand what's going on. We can't just make a blanket moral statement about this is moral, this is immoral, right? We have to understand the nuance of the scenario, to use the words of my colleagues. So, I said I didn't have answers, and alas, I don't. But here are some important things to remember when you're doing programming, when you're doing product development, when you're pitching an idea to a venture capitalist, whatever the case might be. These are not new questions, right? These are long-standing philosophical questions from, ancient Athens, right? People have been struggling with these things for 2,000 plus years. But arriving at an answer is not our end goal, right? What we're hoping as a group forum here, right, is to get you to think about this thing, right? Sit with the question when you're doing your research, or you're doing your product development, or your design, or you're coding something, right? Because particularly in the notion of semantic web, even though we're talking about machine learning, the humans are still encoding the meaning, right, for the machines to then go and read and process and connect. So how we, as human actors, explain something will determine how the machine interpret and then associate these things, right? So just think about how you describe something before you describe it, because it can have long-standing implications, right? And considering those implications, and why you're doing something, how you're doing it, who's involved, so on and so forth. Ask those questions. You don't have to answer them, but consider them. So I think we have just a few moments, and Sara has.
We'll just open it up.
Just go to questions. Cool.
I guess we have Darlin, Rossman, Scott, and I wrote a paper about some Twitter research that we've done, and we developed an ethical framework for asking the kinds of questions that Liv was talking about. And so it was consider context. Justin mentioned this. What are the data privacy norms and policies in your culture or context? Expectations. What are your expectations as a researcher? What are the expectations of the user who is creating the data? And then conducting a value analysis. So what's the balance between the privacy risk, the potential ethical breaches, and then the potential research gain? And it's possible to consult an ethicist. We have a couple of people who specialize in ethics at MSU, so those people can be good resources. And then this is probably the hardest part, is how can this ethical inquiry impact our design and development? So should we think about privacy statements? Should we do some user testing in order to see what are their expectations? Have more transparency about how our algorithms work, and then end your development if you are risking privacy breach, or end your analytical work if you're beginning to see that you're exploiting workers like that. So, with that in mind, any questions? Yes. What is it? It's a digital labor market where people do small tasks in order to compete. Yes.
I have a question around mechanical turk as well, which is if the cost associated with the labelers in mechanical turk, if that outweighed what they would be paid and benefits they were getting from being a part of that, why would they do it?
A lot of them live in third world countries, and so the 4 cents that they're getting paid to, answer our sentiment analysis question could seem like a lot, but for us, it may not be ethical. But I don't know.
Right, which, yeah, and I mean, that's a really valid point, and it goes on with the same rule as sweatshops or something. The benefits are maybe a balance, but there still may be benefits. And the port sense may be a better opportunity than any alternative.
True, but if we can't, as researchers, can pay them a fair wage, that's something we can think about too. If we can write more money into our grant and pay them 30 cents per tweet or something like that, it's definitely something to consider.
Other questions?
I've got maybe a comment. It seems really hard to identify ethical issues before they happen, before they start spiraling out of control. And so, I mean, I guess your guidelines, are attempt to identify those sooner. Yeah, I don't think they have a question. It just seems like a really hard problem.
That's definitely what we've encountered. I mean, we started this research without thinking about ethics, and then the ethical questions came later. And so that's brought us into learning more about it, reading more about it. So I guess that's my advice to you, is if you can read about the ethics of the kind of research you're doing, maybe consult with an ethicist on campus, have a conversation before you begin. Maybe that could help you.
And it's also an iterative process, right? So it's not like, well, I did the research once and it was ethical, so if I do it again, it'll be ethical. Because context matters, right? Yeah. So understanding, the population that you're working with, or the population you're creating a product for, or the way in which you're creating a product, or who you're using as labor to do the research, that all varies with the particular project or particular product. But just even taking a moment to consider, the simple question, is this ethical? Is a great starting point, right? And then there are all these other, areas you can drill down in, to further probe the ethical ambiguity of what they're really doing. But, just taking a moment to ask the simple, well, am I acting ethically? Yes, no. If it's yes, you can probably proceed. If it's no, you should maybe step back further.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
I'm sorry if you already answered this earlier, but do you have to go through the IRB, the same process as for surveys came by campus? For the on-campus list, or we will just on-campus? We did go there, yeah, I think. Waiver. Okay, so.
We did IRB just in case. But that's a really great question because it does highlight some of the challenges of this kind of work, not just from mechanical turk, but social media as well. Because the IRB processes haven't really caught up with this kind of work. And so there's really interesting discussion around how to engage with social media research. Because the text, like the social media posts that users produce, there's even conversation about how to find them, whether that's setting humans or whether that's setting text of the web, in which case you wouldn't even need IRB. We were sort of thinking that you would need IRBs, and so part of this process is also sort of encouraging IRBs to essentially reform themselves and catch up with this.
Okay, with that, let's thank the four of them.